So one structure that both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have in common is the cell membrane. So we're going to look at the cell membrane, the structure of it, and also how it functions. So one of the things to look at for the cell membrane is what is its function? So the main function of the cell membrane is to kind of hold in the contents. So in the last video I talked about it's kind of like a Ziploc bag. So it does hold the contents in of the cell, but it also regulates what can come in and out of the cell. So you can see here in this picture, there are proteins that basically create openings in the membrane to allow materials to come back and forth. Also, these molecules right here, the phospholipids, also allow materials to go back and forth. So it does this job because it doesn't let just anything come into the cell, and it doesn't just let anything go out of the cell. And it does that by being what we call selectively permeable. So it is selectively permeable because of what it's made out of. These little phospholipids. So phospholipids are unusual for a molecule because there's one of them by themselves, these little guys right here. Phospholipids belong to a group of molecules called the lipids. And one of the characteristics of the lipids is that they are going to be what we call hydrophobic. Hydrophobic meaning that they don't like water. They won't mix with water. So if you think of fats like oil and grease, those don't mix with water. And the same thing is true with a phospholipid to a point. So this part of the phospholipid, that part is hydrophobic. Pardon my writing. So that part is hydrophobic. So no water, right? So H2O is a no for this side. But this side likes water. So water is good for the side that we call the head. It is hydrophilic. So that's why these guys line up the way you see them in the picture. The little tails are all in the middle of the membrane because they don't like water, so they're hiding. There's water on this side because this is outside of the cell. There's water on this side, that's the inside of the cell. And so what this does, because these little tails are hiding, this creates an area where water doesn't go. And what that means is not everything can go through this area. So there are materials like water that can't move through this part of the membrane. And so they need help making it through the membrane. So we're going to look at different ways that that happens. Why do we care? One of the things that the cell membrane does is it controls cell communication. So cell communication is actually regulated by materials coming in and out of the cell. So things like hormones and flooding certain things like salts into the cell are going to be what's going to trigger different signals in the cell, for example, like nerve impulses. So these are really important things as far as what the cell membrane is doing for the cell. So let's take a look at, I'm trying to move myself out of the way, there we go, how one of these messages works. So you've got our membrane right here, and you've got a protein. So you can see we've got proteins all over the place in the membrane. This protein is in charge of sending signals. And so it gets a message molecule. So it gets a messenger coming in and telling it, hey, we need to do something. And so the messenger binds to it and says, yep, we got to do something. And so that guy sets off a bunch of chemical reactions inside of the cell to start whatever it was supposed to do. In this case, it's going to start the cell growing and dividing, right? So it could be to start cell division. It could be to start making a new protein. It could be to run away if you're a single cell organism. So that's one of the big things that the cell membrane does. So it holds stuff in, it regulates what can come in and out, and it is in charge of getting messages. So we're going to take a look at how all of these different types of things work. So let's look at one of the ways that materials can move across the membrane. So first one we're going to look at is what we call passive transport. Passive because it doesn't take any energy. Okay? It relies on molecules moving. So in those chemistry chapters and even in the physics chapters, like on heat, we talked about how molecules are constantly moving, whether they're jiggling or they're actually like in a gas or a liquid jostling and bumping around and so forth with each other. So passive transport relies on those molecules moving around on their own. All right, so an example of passive transport that you may have seen is, let's say you've got a cup and it's got water in it, right? And you put a drop of food coloring in. So let's make it green. So you put a nice big fat drop of food coloring into the cup. Now, does the cup instantly turn, does the water in the cup instantly all turn green? No, right? The only way it will pretty much turn green pretty quickly is if you stir it. But if you sit and watch this, you're going to see that that green color starts to spread out from the drop, right? So it'll get green, really close to the drop, and slightly green farther away, right? And so mostly concentrated right around the drop. And then over time, it spreads out farther and farther and farther until, if you've got enough time to sit and watch it, the whole thing will turn green. And so this is what we're talking about passive transport relying on the molecules to move, because we have to wait for them to move from wherever they start to wherever they end up. Okay? Now, molecules always want to move in a specific way, though. So the way we're talking about as far as passive transport, what I just drew with that dye in a cup, is what we call diffusion. So in diffusion, molecules are going to move, but they're going to move on their own. They're not going to need any energy. They just kind of jiggle their way around. But they're going to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So they're going to move from areas where there's lots of stuff to areas where there's not a lot of stuff. So you can think about it where you want to move from a very crowded area to a not crowded area. Right? Same idea. And so what we're talking about as far as molecules that can do this without any assistance are things like oxygen, carbon dioxide. There are a few others, but those are the main ones that you'd be familiar with that can do this. And so if you've got oxygen molecules and you've got your cell membrane, you can see here there are very few oxygen molecules inside of the cell and quite a few outside. So it's crowded out here. Those oxygen molecules are going to make their way through the membrane to the inside. Now, why can these guys do this? These guys can move through the membrane because they actually not really excited about water. They don't like to hang out with water that much. And so they can play in this area where there's no water. So they can move through that area where there's no water in that membrane and move back into the other side. The oxygen molecules will dissolve in water, but not really, really well. And so they will move back and forth across this membrane. And they can do it without any help. Now, there are molecules that need some help. And there is another form of passive transport called facilitated diffusion. Now, this is where you're still getting molecules moving from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So same thing as what we just saw with oxygen. So they're going to move from areas that are crowded to areas that aren't. But this time they need help. They need a transport protein. So they need one of those guys in the membrane to help them get from one side of the membrane to the other. And so who are we talking about? So you can see here we're looking at ions and we're looking at water. So if you remember back to the chemistry stuff, ions are molecules that have either a positive or a negative charge. And so these guys need help because they can't make it through that membrane. Those tails on the membrane, that middle spot, they don't like things that have charges. They don't like things that are positive or negative. And so they won't let these guys through. Water, so water is the oxygen with the two hydrogens. And so if you remember, we talked, yeah, I'm still getting used to working with the pen. So when we talked about that there's electronegativity and some of the atoms like electrons more, we talked briefly about how oxygen likes electrons more, so it gets negative and this section becomes positive. And so that's why water can't move through the membrane. It's got that little bit of positive and negative, plus those tails are there, and those tails don't like water, so they're not going to let it through. So these guys are going to need some help. So they're going to need a protein to let them through. Basically, they need a tunnel. And that's what the protein's going to work as. So you can see here, we've got, these could be water or an ion like a sodium or chlorine, something like that. And so they are going to be in high concentration out here on the outside of the cell, low concentration in this case on the inside, and it can go either way. So in these pictures they're doing high and low, but it could go the other way. So it could be high concentration on the inside, low concentration on the outside. But these transport proteins, like I said, they're going to work like a tunnel. And so there's no energy involved. So you can see no energy. They're just going to open up and let those molecules through. So no power needed. They just allow the material to come through to the other side. Okay, so why might we need energy? Because these are both passive transport. So if we're talking about passive transport, then there must be an active transport, right? And there is. So we've got passive transport where we allow the material to move from high concentration to low concentration on its own, no energy needed. Active transport, this is where we're going to use transport proteins. So we're going to use proteins in the membrane, but we're going to use them to move them against the way they want to go, against what we call the concentration gradient. So they want to move from high concentration to low concentration. You know, they want to move from where it's packed to where it's not. Active transport is going to push them the other way. So we're going to move them from where there aren't many of them and push them into those areas where there are a lot. So we're going to move the molecules from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. So we're basically going to push them to the other side. And this is why it's called active transport. It requires energy. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So you can see we've got a transport protein, so similar to what we saw with facilitated diffusion. But you can see now we've got a high concentration on the inside of the cell, a low concentration on the outside of the cell. Normally, these guys want to go this way, okay? But we're going to put in energy and we're going to move them this way. So you can see this guy's moving into the cell. Okay? And that's why it takes energy, because we're pushing them against the direction they want to go. And so that's what active transport is where we're going to use energy to push these molecules against the direction they normally want to move. There's one more set of ways to move material across a membrane, and this is for big material. So if you want to move large molecules, this is what we're going to do. So all of the other ones, the two types of passive transport, diffusion and facilitated diffusion, and then active transport, that's for little stuff. So that's for ions, water, oxygen. If you want to move big stuff like a protein or a carbohydrate, some big molecule, you're going to need to use a different process. And so you're going to transport these molecules via what we call endocytosis. And so endocytosis means into the cell. So endo for in and cytosis for cell. So into the cell. And I'm going to post this video here of a white blood cell munching down on some bacteria, I think it is. So this is actually what your white blood cells do in order to attack anything that's come into your body. But your regular cells do this in order to bring in big material, all right? And then the opposite is done to get rid of things. So if you're transporting something out, like your cells made a protein or something like that, or if you have waste that you need to send out, you're going to export it out via exocytosis. Exo for out or exit, and then cytosis again for cell. And the two processes actually look pretty much the same. They're just opposite of each other. So you can see here, this side is endocytosis. So the material's coming in, it comes up to the membrane folds in. Those particles get caught, the membrane pinches, and then we get what we call a vesicle, basically a little package of cell membrane with the material inside. Then this can be broken down or transported to wherever it needs to go. The opposite happens for exocytosis. So the vesicle comes up to the membrane, it attaches to the membrane, and then pop, everybody pops out. Okay. So those are the different mechanisms for transport across the membrane.